was quite an amazing event. I was standing next to John Paricelli at the back, the guitar player, and we were just looking at each other with incredulous glances, and we shook hands at the end as if we'd participated in the gig ourselves, which in a way we had.
Torn in around 20 minutes time. Well, on the original broadcast of Torn's gig, I was joined in the studio by John Fordham. I'd asked him in because he'd chosen David's ECM release, Prezens, that's what you can hear in the background at the moment, as one of his favourite records of 2007. So before we listened to the Vortex concert, I spoke to John Fordham, and he told me why he was so keen on the record.
Well, the album just sounded so organic and integrated too. I mean, some of the best things about free improvisation, you know, the freshness and the spontaneity and the surprises, seem to be coupled with an avoidance of most of the worst things about it, which is either that very boring bits go on too long, or bits where something exciting is happening stop before they should. And it just seemed that whether it's Torn's kind of overview as this sort of producer, composer, and everything else he is, as well as an improvising guitarist, or whether it's just something to do with that combination of musicians, but they just seem to sustain the great ideas, and they would always lead into another idea, and then Torn got hold of that music later in the studio and did a bunch of extra things with it, and that was why I was fascinated to hear the performance, because I thought, is this really an improvisation that's been turned into a studio record? Will it work in a live show? And of course it did, absolutely perfectly.
The recording of Prezens was the result of a long and happy period playing gigs with New York saxophonist Tim Berne and his trio with drummer Tom Rainey and the keyboard player Craig Taborn. It was this same band that hit the European road in mid-January, arriving in the UK for a series of dates, beginning with 2 nights at North London's Vortex. It was the second set of the second night, which has pretty much now gone down in legend as one of the greatest gigs of the year so far, and you'll be able to hear that in around about half an hour's time. But first, here's a previously unbroadcast edited extract from the first set, David Torn's Prezens.
Thank you, Craig Taborn, Tim Berne, Tom Rainey. We're going to take a little break and then we play more.
As the man says, we'll have more from David Torn and his group Prezens, recorded live at the Vortex in North London back in January. We'll have the second set of that gig a little later on. That was taken from the first set on the second night of David's two-night residency at the Vortex. Well, Torn's life has been dedicated to an exploration and manipulation of sound, whether producing, mixing, composing, playing guitar or scoring for film. His has been a mission to stretch and massage mould and texture, to chase the sound in his head and to do his best to make us hear his imagination. The young New Yorker's mother saved up Green Shield stamps to buy him his first guitar. He studied as an 11-year-old with Leonard Bernstein as well as Pat Martino and John Abercrombie, who had a huge impact on him. Sparked by Hendrix, he played with various jam bands and made his name in the 1980s with the Everyman Band, and then as a member of Jan Garbarek's group. During that decade, he also made a string of acclaimed records for ECM and began to be sought after as a producer and soundscaper. His work has seen him produce records for Drew Gress, Dave Douglas, Tim Berne and Jeff Beck, and his sounds have graced the records of K.D. Lang, Tori Amos and David Bowie. As a recording artist, though, Torn has all but disappeared from view over the last decade. This is largely due to the fact that his day job is now as a hugely successful film composer. And it was with this this that I began my conversation with David when he passed by the Jazz on 3 studio on the afternoon of his second gig at the Vortex. Well, David, welcome along to Jazz on 3.
Thank you.
Welcome to London on what I know has been a bit of a whirlwind tour throughout Europe for you. Tim Berne working you hard, I think.
It's been, whirlwind is true.
You played the first 2 nights at the Vortex last night. Excited because I'll be there tonight when Jazz on 3 are recording your second night. First night, packed out, lots of David Torn guitar heads in the house, I
don't
believe.
know who those people were, but they were there and they were nice and they stayed, which was really pleasant. Very pleasant.
Okay, now I think that the first thing I have to ask you, because it's pretty rare that we see you playing live in the UK, it's pretty rare that you release a record under your own name now.
Yeah, I had actually thought that I had given it up about 10 years ago,
Right.
about 1999, 2000, when I put out 2 records under a pseudonym that was much more electronic concept and derivation. And I thought that was really going to be the last time I made a record. So
Right. They were the Splatter Cell
that was
projects,
the Splatter
right?
Cell discs,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so but let's get this clear from the start. It's not like you've been relaxing. It's not like you've been retired. You've been a very busy man because you have, well, at least one parallel life, but a few going on, and the major thing you've been concentrating on is your work is on film soundtracks.
Yeah, in the last 4 years, I made a decision to stop being, not that my employers weren't my friends, they are my friends, but I kind of became every composer's bitch in that I was helping quite a few people for very many years do their scores by adding my sound in a typically non-written by them, uncomposed by them way, so making up my own stuff within their scores. Occasionally that was very unsatisfying for me, especially when scores in fact would feature my sounds, my playing, my improvisation, my concepts as a major part of someone else's score for which I get no responsibility. So about 4 or 5 years ago I just decided that I'd throw away all those very high-paying sessions, just chuck them and take a chance on being the composer myself. So I haven't really made a conscious effort to shut music out in any way. In fact, I think it's been quite the opposite, in that Tim and I have continued to play whole bunches of gigs because I can kind of afford to do it now. You know, I can actually say, I'm coming to New York, let's play the Tea Lounge.
So you've described how you actually have been playing live. If you have time in New York, you've been playing with Tim and the group that we're going to hear you with tonight. But as far as us sitting here in the UK, there was this kind of hiatus, and then bang, you know, the album came out. Prezens came out on ECM last year. It was a great record. It made it into Jazz on 3 CDs of the year. So
It did?
Yeah, it did. Yeah. And how did that record come about then? Was this sort of, first of all, back on ECM after a long break, and secondly, Tim dragging you along, saying, come on, you got to make a record?
Tim and I were playing these gigs. Tim and Tom and Craig and I were playing these gigs. They were going, it was so much fun. Can't even begin to tell you. And I called Manfred one day and I said,
Manfred being the head of ECM.
head of ECM, yeah, the honcho, the
Mm-hmm.
auteur, the dude. And I said, Manfred, I'd like to do a band record. And he was, well, send me some live tapes, which I of course had already. Sent him a CD. He says, sure, go ahead. You make it on your own? I said, yes, I will.
And a very exciting record. You know, classically sort of feels very textured. Has moments that feel quite kind of sculpted. But what's interesting about it is, from what I understand, is this record was pretty much done live.
There are a few tracks that are not done live, but they were indeed constructed from as many tracks of integrity as I could put together. There are at least 4 very long, pure improvs, which I only cleaned up and did my little mixing alteration things that I like to do, occasional overdub here and there, but in fact the bulk of the record was done live in the studio.
And was that important to you that the record was like that, and indeed the shows that you're playing, as I understand, they're all completely improvised, because that's very much a counter to, I guess, how you spend the other bit of your life, which is all about kind of form and structure.
It was one of the caveats of Tim and I working together in the beginning, is that I've been involved in so many projects, so many sessions where there is a formatting to the music, there is an idiom within we may be playing. I said, if we have to rehearse and I've got to write, or you have to write and we have to rehearse, I don't want to do it. I think that we're old enough that we could just get together and play and not consider anything else, at least for the moment. And the first gigs really paid off. Musically, it was exciting and scary and not unusual for me, because it goes kind of well back into my youth in being in purely improvising bands, and it just seemed fantastic, like first time. And as we began to play more gigs, I actually recognized that this was maybe the first time I'd been in a purely improvising band where everyone had a compositional outlook to their improvisation, even while they were letting things just happen. Every one of these guys is in some ways a genius at composition. It kind of blew my mind, because by the third or fourth gig, the band had begun to develop a vocabulary, and that vocabulary, not a language per se, but a kind of like sets of vocabulary, like groupings, like little like concept clouds of vocabulary that we could refer to without repeating what we had done on a previous night. And they actually began to develop, which I found extremely exciting, still do. This tour, this European tour that we're doing, it's completely different than what we've done in the past, because typically in the States, in Canada, I'm doing what I did on the record, which is I've got a tremendous sampling, not tremendous, it's small, but it's very powerful sampling rig, and I have microphones on everybody, and or usually at least on Tim on a live show, and I'm sampling while we're playing, and it's coming out through my guitar amps. So I'm constantly like sampling Tim. In the studio it was Tim, Tom, and Craig. Typically live it's just Tim for simplicity, but we're not doing this on this tour. We're just playing. I've got one sampling device with me for one purpose. And
why is that? Is that kind of an excess baggage thing, or is it just a conscious decision, right?
I need to, the band needs to be paid, and there would, and bringing that rig required more people to be on the road with us, as well as the excess baggage issue. So I just brought a tiny little.
Okay, so does that mean that therefore you're focusing more on your guitar work then, because you're not actually thinking about sampling the rest of the
in
band?
a way, but from the sonic point of view, I think according to Tim, I am playing more guitar, but I still have the two devices to manipulate some of the sounds. It's just I'm not doing the cut-up things that I typically would do with very, very short samples and interpolating very short samples of other people and throwing them out. Here I have like one global, more ambient kind of thing that's happening. So it's been quite interesting.
Let's just talk about Tim Berne a bit, because obviously you're very close personally. I read an interview with you where you talked about what a kind of generous guy he was, in as much as who else would lend you their band, in a sense, because this is kind of Tim's trio. And I think it's become a sort of apparent, I think, over the last couple of years doing this show, the new generation of musicians coming through, both in the UK and in the States. There's a few references they come to time and time again, and Tim Berne is really one of those. I mean, albeit that he's still, in some senses, a relatively underground musician. He's certainly not mainstream. His influence is huge, isn't it?
I believe so. It has. I've seen the influence that kind of like leaks through the social system of the New York and European musicians as well, and West Coast also. But certainly I can say without question, he's an amazing guy. He's a pain in the ass sometimes, and he has definitely influenced how I've moved these last few years.
David Torm. Well, that definitely sets us up nicely for the music you're about to hear. The second set on the second night of David's residency at the Vortex in North London, recorded by Jazz on 3 back in January. Now, puff up your cushion, settle down and pin your ears back. Here comes that amazing second set from the Prezens band. Every second of it. Craig Taborn, Tom Rainey, Tim Berne and David Torm.
Tom Rainey. Craig Taborn. Tim Berne. Thank you, folks.